Welcome to our already fourth installment of a joint UNESCO lecture series, The World in 2050, where we endeavor in the bold enterprise to immerse ourselves into a not so close future, applying a rather long distance view, because we think this can be liberating for the present. Our lecturers today come from the Center for Sustainability Transitions at Stellenbosch University in South Africa, Rika Preiser and Tanja Hichert, who hold the UNESCO Chair in Complex Systems and Transformative African Futures at the Center connected with Complex Systems and Systems in Transitions. It's my great pleasure to shortly present you the lecturers. Rika Preiser is an experienced systems thinker with a PhD in philosophy, occupied with thinking through the features and dynamics of complex adaptive systems, and of course, with how to anticipate change of such complex systems in the future. Tanja Hichert is equally a foresight practitioner and expert, specializing in scenario planning, horizon scanning, strategic foresight, risk management, and facilitating strategic conversations that provide clarity and directions for organizations and institutions. And this is quite interesting because, in my personal view, Rika and Tanja's work has been outstanding for quite some time now, and particularly for two reasons, in my view. First, Rika and Tanja are among the most prolific publishers of empirical measurement studies on the practical effects of future studies and futures literacy. And this is extremely important to counter the critique that future studies are somewhat nebulous or don't lead anywhere. On the contrary, the work of Rika and Tanja has proven that there are practical outcomes, that there is a mindset change involved with futures literacy processes, and therefore this empirical development of measurement tools is, in my view, crucial to go forward. And interestingly, we have now the call for a huge global conference in Paris, where we want to develop such tools more broadly and more in depth in a global cooperation of UNESCO Chairs. And I think Rika and Tanja's work will be instrumental to do so. Second, your work, Rika and Tanja, is particularly important because it is directly connected to the UNESCO strategy 2022-2029. So the current UNESCO strategy in place, where there is a strong focal point on Africa and Africa's transformation to become the continent of the future. Some colleagues like Robert Mugabe, the research chief of the Kenyan National Bank, calls it. High expectations for Africa, high expectations for your lecture. And with this very short introduction, I give you the floor, dear Rika and Tanja. So happy to have you with us.
Thank you, Roland. I am going to start screen sharing. Let me just get that all organized. And then Rika and I are going to sort of take turns speaking. And oh goodness, hold on a second. I have now just lost my ability to share screen. See, this is enough to make one very nervous. Hold on just a second, please. And then let me see what happens if I try again. Ah, it is working now. There we go. Could somebody give me a thumbs up if you see a sort of a front cover? Thank you very much. Thank you for the invitation and the introduction. And to start off with just a few comments about Africa. And I guess a little bit of a joke, I suppose we should just right from the very beginning, because many people do this. Africa is not a country. So even though we instinctively know this, many people tend to treat Africa as a country, and maybe us Africans do the same with Europe. You know, we treat it as a country, but it's not. And the little joke is that if Africa were a country, Nigeria would be the planet and Lagos would be the universe. And for those of you that are interested, if anybody has ever been to Lagos, you'll know exactly why I'm saying this, because it is the sort of crazy nexus place of the universe. And we're down in Cape Town, so we're actually physically very far away from Lagos. But it's the demographics, and that's the point I want to make. It's the demographics of Lagos and Nigeria and Africa in particular that will shape our future, every single one of us. So because if we look to 2050, these are UN population projections. If one takes a demographic view of what's going to happen, by the time we get to 2050, which is somewhere around here, nearly a quarter of people in the world are going to be African. And it's this, the vast majority of people now are Asian. And we've had this incredible shift and transformation into the Asian century for quite some time now already, away from the Western world towards the Asian world, and that being the driver of growth. And all of this very much so in the kind of the conventional paradigm of a growing population and very low levels of economic dependency ratios lead to many people that are of a working age, with fewer people that need to be taken care of, less old people that cost a lot of money and have high levels of economic externalities. And then you get this boom kind of thing. Of course, I'm sincerely hoping that we all understand those rules are bound to be bent a little, and if not bent, some of those rules might, just as we go into a very turbulent future, be completely undermined, and that there even might be kind of big tipping points in something as certain as demographic science. But with those provisos and warnings, when one looks at demographics, it is, over the next 30 years, very much going to be the time of Africa. And demographics aside, one of the other reasons, here we go. Let's just stay with Edward Pace. He's written a fantastic book. It's published recently, I think towards the end of last year. It's called Youthquake, and it deals with Africa demographics. So the sheer weight of numbers must bring about a reimagining of African countries and their populations. This alone, just the demographics, will impact geopolitics, global trade, technological development, the future of the world's dominant religions, patterns of migration, almost every aspect of life. And I'm emphasizing this right smack at the very beginning because all of us have a kind of this is not Africa is not on people's radars. It's not spoken about, it's easily forgotten about. It's so funny, we seem to be going through a kind of historic revision again, where Africa is at the receiving end of kind of proxy wars between China and Russia and America. So, you know, it really is just not at the forefront of people's thought processes. The future will be different, okay? So, and then Edward Pace says more widespread familiarity with the continent's diverse demographic characteristics and trajectories is a good entry point for a reimagining. And I'm going to let Rika speak more about reimagining a little bit later, because that's literally one of the things that we spend a lot of our time doing. And then just to add, Adam Tooze, he's a very brilliant historian who does a lot of amazing contemporary analysis work as well at the moment. And he says, we talk about the end of globalization because the great surge in trade between Asia and the West may have plateaued, and it has plateaued because we're kind of seeing this winding down of globalization. but Africa's integration into trade and global communications has only just begun. And there's some really, really amazing work that's being done in terms of agricultural production, food production, climate resilience, all sorts of things like that, that kind of shift one's perspective if you start really paying attention to them. And of course, needless to say, this wonderful graphic, and I'm hoping some of you have seen this and are familiar with this, is that the regular world map that we look at, it makes the Mercator, I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, the fallacy where Africa is seen as slightly bigger than Greenland, okay? That's not how it works in real life. In real life, the African continent happily encompasses all of these other land masses and countries into its land mass. So when I said Lagos, which is sort of around there where Texas would be on the United States, and Cape Town are very, very far removed from one another. So having said this and spoken about some of the vague certainties in inverted commas that we have about how Africa could look completely different given just demographics, I want to emphasize that that's not the kind of work that we do at all. We do not keep ourselves busy with this more kind of, if one looks at the bottom left here, this is based on the work of Matti Mikkonen and his PhD thesis on different foresight frames. And that one has this kind of predictive frame, if you're working with closed systems, and even a planning frame. And many people work in this space. And of course, the scenaric frame, exploring uncertain futures by positing alternatives. Rika and I tend to work very much more in the space that is encircled here in red, with an emphasis on the transformative frame, generating novel paths in the present with indeterminate outcomes. So high degree of normative influencing, really working very strongly from the point of view that we need desperately different imaginings and framings of the future because of the challenges that we face. I'll speak more about that in a minute. And very strongly from a critical frame, questioning given futures and current interpretative frames, especially when it comes to the African continent and work on the African continent. And that is literally, those of you that are familiar with futures and foresight work, is Sohail Inyatullah, who beautifully coined the phrase a used future. If you take a future that exists already from somewhere and you apply it to yourself, or you assume that is what it's going to be like for you, it's a bit like a used car. That is a used future. And we see enormous amounts of that. So every kind of McKinsey, Ernst & Young, Bain & Company, government planning department, foresight futures work, just love doing that kind of stuff, thinking that it's going to be very progressive if we have cities on the African continent that look like Asian cities, or that look like versions of Western cities of the 1980s, you know, shiny skyscrapers and big highways. And that is specifically why we work from a critical frame. That's not the kind of work that we do. And here's the reason why. It's because we're faced by this convergence of crisis. The word polycrisis is popular these days. And this is from climate change to economic instability, inequality, poverty, very low levels of human development in many places of the continent. And of course, the energy crunch. And that's something we experience on a daily basis. It makes it necessary to call into question the conventional development paradigm. Now, that conventional development paradigm is based on the exploitation of nature. I'll never forget how struck I was my first visit to Paris many years ago. And I went to the museum that shows the history of Paris and how it originated. And there was this wonderful, it starts off with the geographic kind of location where Paris is located geographically in the planet. And it was forest, it was all forested. And of course, all those forests were chopped down, and the beginnings of Paris was built from wood of the forests that are chopped down. And of course, now there's no forest to be found anywhere near Paris. And then the forests are, as you can see here, in Central Africa and Central America, South America. So we can't chop those forests down like everybody used to. And the same goes for fossil fuel, et cetera, et cetera. So while it's imperative that we rethink how to develop and how to progress in inverted commas, it becomes a very, very critical issue for us here, nearly more so than what is the case over there. And just illustratively, we think this quote is ascribed to Einstein, who cannot solve our problems with the same thinking that we used when we created them. But I have yet to find if it wasn't him who did say this. Rika, I'm going to hand over to you, and my button, my progress button is in your power. So just say the word, and I'm going to let you speak of the kind of work that we do in terms of thinking and doing differently.
Yeah, thank you, Tanja. And hello, everyone. It's really great to be with you. Yeah, my focus, the shared focus that Tanja and I have for this chair, obviously, is to think about the future differently in Africa, but also from a, I think, combined theoretical perspective. So we try and use conceptual frames also and innovate them in ways that allow us to reach a broader audience and to be more critical of current frames and ideas that are there. And the frame or the theoretical base, I think, that we use is this idea that comes from systems thinking. And my own work has really been focused on how can we translate the ideas that come from, you know, the natural sciences, mainly on complexity that comes from, you know, the natural sciences and how people understand complex adaptive systems from there. How do we apply those ideas and that worldview as a kind of a really interconnected worldview to sustainability challenges? Although we don't, you know, worry about the population growth or can't do a lot about that in Africa, what we do worry about and what we do research really is to try and understand, you know, what are the resource and sustainability challenges that will come up in, you know, in the next 30 to 50 years in our continent. And we find the work or the ideas that are captured in this complex adaptive systems thinking very helpful to use, because it allows us to translate those ideas into a language around which we can gather students, researchers, but also stakeholders, policymakers, from very different areas. And once we start speaking about this understanding or this notion that humans and nature are not disconnected from each other, and that we cannot think about pathways forward or futures without this connectedness, and understand our how you know, current I would say frameworks disconnect these, you know, ideas of growth and sustainability from each other. That's really the space where we work from. So we've kind of do a lot of translations to, you know, to provide people access to these ideas of interconnected human nature systems from a complexity perspective in easy ways, or in ways that are easily understood and inclusive as well. Tanja, you can do the next slide. And of course, this is the, you know, wonderful conceptual framework also to ground futures work in, and, you know, the practical tools that we use when we do foresight work as well. So just a little bit more concrete, when we zoom into our space, we're based in close to Cape Town in Southern Africa. Stellenbosch University is about 30 kilometers outside of Cape Town. And we're a university size, about 30 to 40,000 resident students, about 60,000 when we take into consideration all the students that are doing postgraduate work and not resident in Stellenbosch. Next slide, Tanja. And for many of you, your engagement with Stellenbosch might be the beautiful winelands, very picturesque city and nature around us. Really beautiful, I would say, architecture from our heritage and origins, kind of in settler origins. But the reality in which we are actually situated socially and economically looks much different. And also this geographical depiction really expresses also, you know, the kind of challenges that we deal with also when our students come with us. We have, as you can see on the right, you know, town planning as such already expresses the inequalities that exist in our communities. We have very different kinds of communities living in close proximity in Stellenbosch. Next slide, Tanja, which is quite unique, I would say, for our South African setup. And also our university setting finds itself within these, I would say, tensions of inequalities. Our students come from the very rich end of the spectrum to students who live in informal settlements, and that brings with it all the challenges of inequality, access, Black Lives Matter, but also how do we think about knowledge creation and practice in this space. Next slide. So when we speak about transitions, it's really to think about transitions in a very practical and very tacit way. It's not just a concept for us that we can project onto some kind of policy brief or sustainability idea. It's actually has real world impacts that we feel very close to us every day. Our center was established in 2016 as a flagship center in Stellenbosch University to address the deeply intertwined challenges of environmental and social sustainability. We use an interdisciplinary and transdisciplinary research approach to study these ideas. And I would say that the ideas of how we think about transitioning into the future is deeply embedded in the challenges that we face here. Tanja, next one. The research focus that we have and the kind of thematic themes that we work on, it's really about using these complex adaptive systems, human nature interconnectedness, social ecological transformations, and social technical transitions as the kind of foundational base to think about sustainable and just futures. And we use, our spaces in the university through education and training and research to also connect with science policy practices, to speak about and research knowledge co-production, resilience, futures thinking, finance and resource flows, and political and economical development. And yeah, those ideas are then, I would say, tested in the spaces of food, energy, and climate, cities, and how we rethink and reimagine human nature connectedness. Next slide, Tanja. So I think a huge challenge and a huge question for us is how do we reimagine the current world that we live in? And I think one of the biggest challenges we face is to think about how do we bring about change by thinking these intertwined challenges together, not just social development or, I would say natural conservation or resource development, but how do we think about those things as totally interlinked and intertwined? So the question of understanding how change and transformation happens in a world that is interconnected is, we can only think through that by understanding that this world is, complex and interlinked in ways that are, that produces uncertainty and, definitely surprise. Many of our stakeholders are interested in questions about governance and change making, activism, and really on the I would say the grassroots level. And that's where the work of Tanja's deep insights of working in this development space with futures thinking or foresight has really, I would say, opened new doors for us to launch research into.
Thank you, Rika. I'm going to stop sharing and hand over to you to share, to show that just a sort of a little short whiteboard video that encapsulates some of our early work. And then there's just a few other slides left, and then we can go over into some conversation.
Right. This is a project called Seeds of Good Anthropocenes. And I'm just going to play it. It's something that we did in 2016. And this video just shows a little bit of an outcome of how we started to reimagine and use foresight work in thinking about a different future for Africa.
We live in turbulent times and are surrounded by visions of dark and uncertain futures. Societies are changing, and people are transforming the environment, the entire planet in unexpected ways. In many places, we are increasingly disconnected from nature and from each other. These are key symptoms of a new geological era, which scientists call the Anthropocene. But there is hope. There are seeds of positive futures all around us, seeds of good Anthropocenes. These seeds are projects, organizations, initiatives that are experimenting with doing things differently and making an impact for the better. Better for people and better for our planet. But for now, these seeds are small, local, and not part of the mainstream. What would happen if these seeds were to grow? If they became towering trees with interlocking networks of roots, supporting and nourishing each other? What if these seeds became the way we do things, the way the world works? What would the future look like? This is what we asked a group of scientists, artists, and changemakers at a workshop in Cape Town in November 2016. Starting with 4 sets of very different seed projects and initiatives, we asked the participants to imagine what Southern Africa would be like if these seeds were to grow, combine, and become the new normal. We asked them to stretch their imaginations. We asked them to dig deep. As a result, the participants developed 4 radically alternative positive visions for the future. Although these visions differed in their details, they had many striking commonalities. All 4 futures are deeply shaped by technology. This technology is used in a way that enables people to connect to each other, to develop a shared understanding and empathy, rather than become isolated and distrustful. Technological advances also free people up from working just to pay bills. Instead, people work to contribute to their community, live fulfilling lives, and express themselves as human beings. In all 4 futures, power is highly decentralized, and people actively participate in decision-making. Societies are more equal and fair, and value the unique differences between people. Collaboration, rather than competition, is a core ethic. These values extend to humanity's relationship with the environment. Thoughtless exploitation of resources is replaced by responsible stewardship of nature, which is understood to belong to everyone. Most food and other goods are produced locally, minimizing transport and waste. Overconsumption is replaced by flourishing societies in which people respect ecological limits and each other. Idealistic? Yes. Impossibly utopian? No. These are our visions, and the seeds of these futures already exist. Let us nourish them, be inspired to plant more seeds, and let it grow into a beautiful new world.
Okay. Fantastic. Thank you, Rika, for screen sharing there. It didn't work from my side earlier. I'm going to screen share again and just get you to talk us through the following 3 or so slides, which also involves our work. And I'll do the final one, and then I think we can go over into some conversation. So, oops, where's my sharing now? Hold on. I have a brand new computer, so it's doing its best to make me a little bit nervous here. All right, that's working, isn't it?
Sure.
Fantastic. Oops, wrong one. There we go. Over to you, Rika.
Yeah, so just to say that the research that we've started by using foresight and futures literacy and futures ideas, inspired by so many of the work that you've been doing, we implement that in our training. So these are some postgraduate students just last week and 3 weeks ago, where we offered 2 week-long training sessions using futures wheels, the various foresight methods, icebergs, through horizons. About 120 students were taken through that process. Next slide. The methods are becoming deeply embedded in our teaching programs and also in our funding and research programs. This is a MOOC we launched in 2022, 2021, 2022 through the funding of USAID on anticipatory governance. It was really set up for thinking about anticipatory governance in a development context. almost 300 participants graduated this course. More than 1,200 started it and engaged with some of the material. And I think that was a really exciting project. This MOOC ran for a year, and we're hoping to continue that with some modifications through the UNESCO platform. Tanya, next one. And we've also kind of been asked by various development agencies to engage in research projects and do training with development funders, but also development decision makers in Africa by using foresight methods to think about how can we change development funding, for example, and research funding in the continent. We've run several of those projects. Currently, there's also some funded projects through UK development organizations. And yeah, Tanya is also very involved at this moment. Both of us are kind of engaged in looking also at research for development. How can we use foresight methods in that differently? Tanya, next one.
Yeah, and that's it before giving you a list of further resources and reading if you're interested. So most of what we've spoken about is available through a link, and we'll share these slides. And this is just a screenshot really to show a database that we've just built based on horizon scanning, sort of 3 months worth of horizon scanning, looking at the contextual environment of what possible disruptors and enablers are there in this world of research for development. And you know, to be honest, research for development is sort of very much a donor northern term. We just call it research. I think we don't speak about development because I mean, yeah, I don't know, these assumptions, you know, what does development mean? Does it mean catch up to over consuming as much as North Americans? Does it, you know, it's difficult. But anyway, so in terms of research and knowledge and the science that gets done and how we think about the world and how we engage with it, there's this really fantastic database at the moment. It's not really quite yet for public release, but it will be available publicly. And what you can see here is these classifications between, is this weak signal, is it a mega driver, or a driving force shaping the future, a mega trend, or is it an enabler, a disruptor? So it's a kind of really categorized horizon scanning system that's been built with the different, those of you that do futures and foresight work, steep V domains: social, technological, environmental, economic, political, and values. So really to be a sort of a living resource for if one wants to engage around futures and foresight work, and particularly around disruptors and enablers. So this is it, just to give you the further reading references, just a few of the, these are good articles around the sort of demographic role of Africa in 2050, which ultimately is the topic of the series of lectures. This third bullet here, pushing boundaries to create positive visions for future of Southern Africa. If you click into that, it'll take you to the little whiteboard video that we showed, and you can click into it from there. There's Rika's wonderful publication on key features of complex adaptive systems, and really with this emphasis on practical implications for guiding action. Rika is particularly skilled in taking the complexity out of complexity. Rika, I'm allowed to say that, aren't I? And then lastly, there's also, this is a superb resource, the Rutledge Handbook of Research Methods for Socio-Ecological Systems. It's open access. It's the most downloaded handbook last year, if I'm not mistaken. Rika, is that correct? Yeah. And what is fantastic about it, it's got chapters on futures analysis and all the methods and things that we've been talking about. It's also got, and it's got a dedicated chapter on scenarios and different methods for generating or building scenarios. You know, there's a hell of a lot more out there than just the regular 2x2 that everybody seems to still want to use. And then Rika's work in complexity and action research, and then a myriad of other methods as well. So there's a really useful handbook. And I guess just to end off by saying that some of this methodology that we've here now featured very quickly and spoken about how we think and work based on the work down here, has traveled quite nicely and has been taken up. Roland, I think you alluded to some of this at the beginning. It's not that empirical, actually. It's more the method that's been taken up. So, for example, this seeds methodology of working with these pockets of the future in the present and these weak signals, that's been taken up now by Donut Economics Lab. So, you know, the whole donut economics concept and the practical work that they do and the lab work that they do is actually using the methodology that we developed way back in 2016. So I'm going to stop sharing. These slides are available, and I think I hand over to Chiara, to you. Are you going to moderate us a little bit, or how does it work?
I think I'm going to moderate you. Thank you for this truly excellent introduction, dear Rika and Tanja. I always wonder how you can manage such a broad range of issues that you are covering. If we saw the last slides, you're really covering almost the whole spectrum of complexity. And I think you are at the source of one transformative hotspot in the world. Indeed, as you presented it, Africa could really become a transformative actor in the new globalization. We are facing a globalization that is much more divided between democracies and non-democracies, with rising powers that challenge also Africa a lot, with the government in South Africa, where you are located, that is undecided or even clinging much more to the autocratic side than to democracy at the moment, at least concerning the war in Ukraine. So a very complex environment also that you're engaging. And we are now accepting questions from the participants. And we have already one by one of our colleagues, Ted Fuller. I would have at least 10 questions, but I will limit myself because it's so inspiring to just a few. Let me start with Ted Fuller. He writes, "Hi Rika and Tanja, you are doing brilliant work. What are the key concepts from complex adaptive systems that you incorporate into your approach to future thinking? What should other futurists learn from this?" That is the question of Ted Fuller.
Thank you, Ted. That is a jackpot question. I think what we did over a time also is we've kind of scanned the literature of complex adaptive systems research, and it's really vast, as you would know, and came up with an idea to cluster features of complex adaptive systems. Because when you start engaging and reading that literature, you see that whoever speaks about complexity, devises some kind of definition or criteria from where they are. And we wanted to kind of synergize this literature and ideas for students and practitioners from a very wide field of research and practice. So we looked at the literature, and we kind of clustered those features together in terms of how those systems or those features show up in the world, physically or in reality. And we came up with 6 features. These features are very easy. They're almost like intuitive. So we would say that all systems are relational, they're radically open, they're adaptive, dynamic, they are come about through complex causes, and that they are, I would say, they engage with each other indeterminately. So those ideas can then, they are very easy to use. They're not kind of using the jargon of, the complexity science in a sense. And if we think about that, or the contextuality is the other one. All systems come about through certain kind of a context, embeddedness, for example. So if you think about those ideas, can really easily be translatable to any method that you would like to use in futures work. So what kind of futures methods allow us to see how things are relational, interconnected, connected with each other? For that, we use specific, something like futures wheels to show, how are impacts relational, how are things kind of connected, how's connectivity or network effects part of our ideas of how future ideas can impact other ideas. The idea of openness, that, you know, all systems are open, is very nicely understood, I think, through the method of the 3 horizons, where, you know, even time can't be, time scales aren't just closed off units, you know, but that time, cross-scale connections between time. So, you know, different kinds of horizons shows that kind of openness between different modes. The notion of contextuality is nicely, I think, explored by ideas in, you know, now what is specific for a specific context. The seeds ideas, for example, you know, that those the seed initiatives, they are small, contextually based ideas and initiatives that respond to their context immediately, and that the challenges of the future, and then we use those. We draw on them to say, well, if these things are contextual, what, you know, how would they link up if we would kind of connect these with each other, and then understand how could they, you know, influence something on a larger scale of impact. So those are three of the features, at least. We can link them back to all the others, but you know, we kind of use a language and an understanding of complexity that is extremely intuitive, easy translatable, and then we link those methods to kind of, I would say, highlight or illustrate those features of complexity. And it's worked very well. It's given us a wonderful way of also allowing people why these futures methods are actually so useful in addressing, you know, interconnected complexity or uncertainty, for that matter.
I wanted to jump in super quickly, Rika, and just say, you mentioned useful. Yes, we like being practical. So, yeah.
Yeah, and there's been a kind of a hidden conversation in the background about the term emergence, brought forward by Ted Fuller, and Tanja, you answered emergence is everything. Can you explain this a little bit further? I think there are key terms in any historical passage, key terms that really decipher many ongoings at the same time. Would emergence be such a key term for our time?
Absolutely, and without going too theoretical or technical, and maybe Ted, you know, maybe you should unmute and share your thoughts, which would be fantastic. Especially if one looks at the emergence of the discipline of anticipation, that is bringing this kind of thinking to the fore, and then of course not just the thinking but the great need for the doing in terms of working practically with these concepts is what is so critically important. I was joking a little bit when I said emergence is everything, but Ted, please chime in, and I guess we should also, I see there's another question.
Right. Now there's a question by Julia Vögele. Thank you so much for your exciting contributions. Can you give examples of how the future visions are currently being implemented? Is the focus of your projects generally on putting it into action?
Oh, sorry, I've got a ringing phone here next to me. Let me just, there we go. Goodness, Julia, that's a difficult one, because I mean, who puts things into action? You know, we live in an extremely complex, turbulent environment, and what I find fascinating is that the more stable Western developed parts of the world are starting to join us in terms of being more turbulent and volatile and complex. So, you know, everybody puts everything into action constantly. We don't, as such, have policymakers that follow evidence-based research and then put policy solutions in place. You know, things just really do not work like that here where we are, which brings us back to the concept of emergence. So a lot of the work that we've been doing in these visions are unfolding all around us by myriads of different people and actors and stakeholders, and some of those have more power than others but it's all this turbulent sort of mess in the present that's busy shaping the future. But there isn't any kind of action plan of putting these things, making the future happen. It's much more, I hesitate to say hoping for the best. Rika, I hand over to you, with an emphasis on the extreme importance of the role of values and ethics and relating and connecting, to do that which addresses these massive challenges that we are facing.
Yeah, I can maybe just add to that. These opportunities that we engage stakeholders and decision makers with futures work allows us to I would say convene people together in processes that usually wouldn't talk to each other or connect with each other, even because of their positionality in society, and that allow us. We specifically design these kind of interactions and use our ways of designing these, I would say, foresight processes in ways that that allow us to allow people to create new relationships with each other, to create new conversations, to have different people who can actually have conversations with each other, and to reimagine together. And I think we've seen that these processes, they take people away from their functional roles and their stuck ways of communicating with each other, and that there is already a huge practical, I would say, benefit for us in allowing those kinds of conversations to happen. Tanja, also, I think you underplay the work that you do in other spheres. I mean, there's lots of agricultural scenarios that have come out in your recent work where you've actually engaged agricultural stakeholders and governance entities to think together how they would reshape, how agriculture is envisaged in our area and also in broader African areas, working with organizations, like the UN or UNDP or, World Bank or those kinds of, I would say, parastatal organizations allow us to shape planning and funding processes. So we don't translate, we can't see how these things are translated one by one, but it actually allows us to translate, I would say, on different levels and to have practical implications on different levels.
Yeah, I thank you for this input. Tanja, you asked me what I feel about all this or where we stand. And just to make it very short, I think the challenge is really, if you really want to confront and address complexity in highly dynamic environments as we have them at the moment, it is about building kind of an ecosystem. And my question was exactly in that direction. We are trying to build an ecosystem from the scratch. And the second aspect is that you are always in competition to existing governmental foresight practices and programs. And they have their very specific mindset. They are about outcome, about productivity, about electoral promises, and so on. I wonder, and that was my original question, how do you build the ecosystem? How do you build the relationship between activism, science, very strong, as I stressed, and governmentality? I mean, you have to involve also those who are in power. So tell us a little bit more about your experience of how to build a working ecosystem of change involving the stakeholders. And the second question I would have is, what is the role, in your view, of sustainability and resilience? Because as we noted now, also more recently, Tanja and Rika, in our last week's visit to Paris, where we visited UNESCO and the OECD, the Association of the Most Developed Countries in the World, there is a huge gap between apparently global sustainability advancement, which is brought forward mainly by UNESCO, educational issues, and the rather resilience-oriented discourse of the OECD, which stresses out that we must build robust systems that can withstand disruptions, that can withstand overcomplexity that is going out of bounds and leads to systemic crisis. So there seems to be at the moment in the macro discourse, also within the United Nations, a kind of disparity between the discourse of sustainability and the discourse of resilience. How do we reconcile them? I'm sorry for the very complex question.
No, this is fascinating, Roland. I'm going to your first question very quickly and shortly, and then I'm going to bounce it over to Rika again and just say we're extremely lucky and privileged right from the very beginning. Our center and our collaboration with one another and the work that we do has always been transdisciplinary. And so in a way, it's not only the nature and the characteristic of the type of work. So there, the concept of stakeholders is much broader than you could ever imagine. And so it's both, it informs our work, but it also gives us the opportunity to work in a way that allows us to work somewhat differently, which is fantastic. And I'll bounce the rest of that off to Rika. So there's never a question, never an issue. We are transdisciplinary. And then that so takes care of any sort of who is it that we engage with and why and how, etc. On the one hand. On the other, Roland, I'm going to add more complicatedness to your question about resilience and sustainability. And you know, there's a whole lot of stuff that isn't really just even spoken about. If you take it from a, I hate the terminology global south, but if you take it from a global south perspective, this whole sustainability argument and net zero and 1.5 degrees and all that kind of stuff. It's impossible to get to those goals, and people are starting slowly to talk about it. I'm starting to see things. It's impossible to achieve these things without having deeper, more acutely uncomfortable conversations about things like sacrifice and equality that nobody seems to be talking about. I mean, this whole thing that if you're a citizen of North America, you use something like 5,000 kilowatts of energy per person, I can't remember the metrics or whatever, and Nigeria, it's a couple of hundred. And you know, those levels of human development on the African continent are nowhere near where they should be. And now we're supposed to be mitigating. It's ridiculous. You know, so African countries that are whacked 10 times harder. We're starting to see the little bit of beginnings of funds to make amends for climate change impacts. But I mean, really, we are, and a lot of the academic work at our center is around just energy transitions. But we're expected by the global civilization to stop burning coal so that, you know, and do something else. But nobody is talking about using less energy, or at least trying to go to net zero absolutely immediately for everybody that's been using the whole wodge of energy already. So the whole debate in sustainability, according to me, and this is a personal viewpoint, by the way, is in a way a kind of a skewed debate, and I'm not a sustainability person. That's the one thing. The resilience thing, again, for us, we've actually kind of moved beyond already. We need to be able to withstand, or we need to be able to bounce back or whatever, because that's what we've always done, Roland. I mean, you know, you could start where you want to. Slavery, colonialism, proxy wars, structural adjustment programs implemented by neoliberalism. The African continent people have always had to be deeply resilient and be able to withstand. So the whole resilience argument, I guess, is now a hell of a lot more around how can we be innovative? How can we be innovative in the face of this incredible transition that we need to go to have some kind of acceptable level of human development within planetary boundaries. So the words sustainability and resilience actually mean completely different things for us. Back to the point I made right at the beginning, this thing about research for development, you know, we just call it research. So yeah, there are many nuances and views and things of this, but there's a debate from our perspective and concepts that I think one needs to engage with quite differently. And I'm watching the clock. I'm giving over to Rika and stopping talking.
Yeah,
No,
I think I might
sorry.
just have two ideas to say. I think it depends, like Tanja said, about I think these words, sustainability and resilience, have been used very differently by huge development organizations. We've seen an upsurge in the use of resilience in a consortium of development organizations that want to bring the focus of sustainability or development work as such back to resilience, which is the idea that communities should take their own responsibility to how do you kind of, I would say, inform communities to do that. And that is a huge top-down understanding of resilience, of course, and sustainability, which wants to relieve, I would say, these huge organizations of some kind of different kind of responsibility. It's problematic for us to use those words in those ways. I think what we've become to use is to see the notion of resilience not as something that will remain. How do we but more to understand this notion of the resilience as the capacity to be able to transform. And with that, comes all the uncertainty and all the changes that have to happen. So for Africa, we are resilient. In poverty is also kind of a very resilient system. So how do we learn where are the openings and the leverage points to break down oppressive resilient systems? So I think this is where the critical perspective really comes in, is when we think of sustainability and resilience, we always ask for whom and who's benefiting, to what effect. Those are the questions that we add on to those statements or impulses to sustainability or resilience. Do we just keep those who are elite and empower resilient or empower, or do we open up spaces for allowing difference and different experiences of the world to also emerge? And I think that's where the interesting work is happening on our continent at the moment, is that we want to use also futures work to ask those difficult questions and to keep it integrative and open, not to shut down relations and to be self-inflicted, but in a sense to open up spaces where we can have those difficult conversations together. And I think futures work allow us to really do that in a beautiful way.
Yeah, I think this is maybe the most important point, to go beyond this homogenized discourse on sustainability, which seems to be clarified once and for all. There is sustainability, we must pursue it. But in reality, there are many different realities to apply it or to develop it from. And I think one of the most important tasks in my personal view is really to differentiate these two concepts and to make them more participatory also from the side of the global south, the so-called global south. And that is exactly what UNESCO at least is trying to do at the moment. And you certainly have a crucial role in that, because you're inspiring others. I have a very final remark by Letizia Gentel: build capacities to enable internal change to address and redress complex issues. I think this is a nice, to redress complex issues, Letizia says. And this leads us to the final question from my side, at least, concluding, what can we learn from you? We are planning an Africa conference, a very limited format, African South Tyrol leadership development together. And the point is that we want to learn from African leaders from different experiences in completely different framework, what we can apprehend from their experience to be more differentiated and to be more diverse in our leadership. Now, we have been criticized that this is a kind of impossible endeavor, that Africa is too different. Europe, it's very difficult to learn from Africa, and if we try to do, it's a fake because we were the colonizers. So it's really, as you said, Rika and Tanja, a complex endeavor to create a just and sincere conversation. Maybe your final remarks on this huge topic that may accompany us over the coming years.
I'm handing straight to Rika. She's the philosopher, and also quite fascinating. Rika's had some years of involvement with Rika's called the Comenius Institute that come to South Africa and CST to learn, and specifically at the level of leadership, senior leadership. So Rika, over to you. And Roland, just do it. Don't worry about people criticizing and thinking whether it's possible or not. Just do it.
We'll do. Yes.
I think what we learn in being here and working with our colleagues in these spaces is that there isn't a correct answer or a correct way to deal with any of this. There isn't a recipe book for how to change things or how to engage or how to reach out. Getting our hands dirty, having the courage to become human together in these spaces is the key to engage. It's when we lose sight of our humanity, our shared humanity, that we start making categories and analysis and put spreadsheets on things and make divisions. But when we connect through our shared humanity, and our wishes and our dreams for the future, that's where we have a common ground. And that's the entrance point we use, and that's the beautiful entrance point that Foresight and Futures work allow us. Is we've also done that, in our spaces. You've asked earlier, how do we create those ecologies? Building trust. When you ask someone to share their dream for the future, we find out very soon that people have the same values, the same dreams for their futures, which is to be able to, offer their children or their families or their colleagues, a space to dream on in the world. And if we use that entry point, that becomes the space from where we can start having difficult discussions, where we can start learning from each other. And when we open up really the doors of our perceptions and our experiences to each other.
Thank you both so much for this impression that you gave us. This was a very, very interesting talk. I invite everybody, consult the links that Rika and Tanja gave us. It is worth it, and it will get you forward in a more differentiated view on what is needed for the future. Thank you very much for your contributions. Thank you all for following us. Please be back with us next time. Thank you to South Africa. Thank you, Tanja and Rika. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Roland.
Thank you, Roland. Goodbye.
Bye.
Goodbye, everyone.